Hello and welcome to another episode of the Random Thoughts podcast. We have a new environment.
Studio. We're fancy.
Full studio. We've got some books in the background. Makes us look just a little bit smarter, I think.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yep. Great. I'm super excited. I hope it sounds good. We are continuing to work on making this sound better and also look a tiny little better and just be better in general because that's what we're chasing.
Yeah, just incremental progression with everything we do. So if it sounds a bit funky, if you're watching and it looks a little funky, let us know.
Yeah. Apologies if it does because this is the first version in here.
Nothing like going live with your test run.
And we haven't built, so if you're freaking out, thinking we've built a studio, we haven't built a studio. We're just using a repurposed console room.
Yeah, it's a flexi studio.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're going to talk about today?
Let's talk about groins, adductors, and often a neglected muscle group in the lower body, but so important for kicking, running, change of direction, and everything involved.
And I think important. We'll talk about from an injury prevention standpoint, but also I think just from a performance standpoint,
it's a double-edged sword.
I think it's really good to think of your Adductor Magnus in particular as an extra hip extensor. I think when something's named a certain thing, you think it is just an adductor because it's called Adductor Magnus, whereas actually it does a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, you don't. Well, if we stay on Adductor Magnus for a bit, from a anatomical point of view, it's almost another hamstring. Yeah, it's so big and it sits so far back.
Chunk of your leg.
Yeah, it's that big chunky one on the inside of the leg, and it plays a big role in hip extension. It's should we talk about external rotation?
Okay, I've stuffed this up. Let's take it back a tiny bit.
Let's take it back.
Let's talk first about why adductors in general are a big deal.
Yeah, let's go more broad. We went a little too narrow, didn't we?
We're too excited because it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, let's go broad, big picture first.
Big picture. The number one thing you want to do as an athletic development coach, as a strength and conditioning coach, is minimize the injury rate of your team, squad, cohort. So you want to make them bulletproof. A really important element of that is having really strong bulletproof adductors so that your hip complex is strong, stable, and safe. So you're not susceptible to a whole host of injuries. Weak hips are going to leave you more likely to get adductor injuries, but also there's a knock-on effect where you can have a higher prevalence of ACL risk. There's all sorts of other long-term wear and tear, patellofemoral things. There's so many things wrapped up in having a weak hips. Yeah, so you want to have strong bulletproofs that don't break and that also support the rest of the kinetic chain really well.
There's one big important piece in there that we just sort of flew through in that little piece that you gave there, was that injury rehab and prehab and preventing injuries, it's part of high performance. Yeah. Because if you think about it, the number one goal is to get as much training in, to get as much adaptation to perform to the best of your ability. Yeah. That's kind of the ultimate goal of sports coaching, strength and conditioning, sports science, the whole lot. When it comes to injury prevention, injury rehab, if you can just be injured less, if you can just not miss a single training session all year long, that's 20% more than the person who misses 20% of their training because of an injury.
If you can not get injured and not get sick, we're talking about, potentially 30% more training you can get into that season.
And if you just do the math, the extra minutes, the extra shots you get up, the extra kicks you get in, the extra Ks you get to run, the difference is astronomical.
It's not a one, and yet people spend so much. People get so interested and obsessed with the 1%ers, with the sand. Like the big rock is don't break, stay healthy, and be strong.
There's a cool study from the AIS. I believe it was 2015. I'll find the link, and it said that athletes who hit, I think it was you had to complete 80% of your training, so 4 out of 5 sessions for the year in the preseason. And you were 3 times more likely to achieve your preseason training goal. So you start the season, you're a 100-meter sprint, and say, I want to go from 11.2 to 11.0 something. I want to get in the low 11s. And then you do your season training. You are 3 times more likely to get that if you just do
80%.
Not even all, just 4 out of 5 sessions.
Yeah, which is not to say you should cut everything back by don't cut everything back by 20%.
Yeah, if things are going good, try and hit 100 because you need that buffer if something goes wrong.
The point being that ability to have that threshold of not breaking. So when we talk about that, I think having a healthy, stable hip musculature is really important, and preventing adductor strains is a big deal. Super important for soccer, very important in basketball, football, and probably triply important in female sport. I think it's
the female athlete.
It's worth emphasizing because the female hip, the musculature of the female hip has to work so much harder than males because the female pelvis isn't straight, not generally as straight as the male pelvis. So the muscles are just having to kind of work around corners. So
do you want to expand a little on the Q angle, which is what you're kind of alluding to?
So the shape of the female pelvis has to be that shape in order for a baby to be able to pass out of the birth canal. And what that means is that instead of, if you think of the male pelvis, you've kind of got the hips and then almost a plumb line straight down.
To the knee. Yeah.
You've got the femur. Whereas the female pelvis has, the hips are wider and therefore the shape down to the knee kind of caves in a bit. It's called a valgus moment at the knee. And that's a really important, and people focus on that at the knee a lot, but at the hip it's also really big.
It kind of it starts from the hip is the lead domino in that situation.
And so for the female athlete, they've already got a higher predisposition to ACL in general across sports. And they just get, in my experience in 13, 14 years of WNBL stuff, they get more fatigue, they get more DOMs through their adductors and through their hips than guys would with an equivalent amount of work, because the muscles are having to work just harder. Each per square inch of muscle just has to work a little bit harder.
It's an increased local point of fatigue because it's just got more demands placed on it all game long, all training long. And
it's on a continuum. So some girls have got pretty square hips, and they are generally, like if you look at the last 10 years of finals of Olympics 800s, 400s, in fact, most elite running, the girls that are great at it, pretty straight hips.
Pretty shallow Q angles.
Yeah. Pretty boyish hips, really, because they're more biomechanically efficient. So everything you can do to make that groin stronger is going to be massively beneficial. So that's why this stuff's a big deal. It's performance and it's also injury reduction. Yeah. Do you reckon that's enough we can dive into that?
So that's
the general importance.
That's general injury prevention. That's general the importance of the hip as a part. And the adductor, I think, is probably the most neglected component of that hip complex. So if you think about glute max, you've got the core on top of it, you've got the hamstrings and the quads underneath. That inside part, that groin and that adductor group, really neglected.
And I should point out too that you can it's neglected, but also it's an area where you can easily make good gains in terms of injury risk and performance. You can make teams pretty bulletproof if you put the work in. We had, I want to say, one player over 13 years missed games to groin injuries in the WNBL group.
Which is for a 13 years of female athletes in a very change of direction dominant sport. Yeah. It's a pretty good record.
And I just think that it just shows what you can do if you maintain good tissue quality. So if you roll and you stretch, good activation and good basic strength. And a couple of little specific things that we'll dive into as well.
Yeah. I think before we go much further, I think it's worth talking about, because they're called the adductors, and people think of adduction towards the midline, so it brings the leg back underneath you.
So abduction is when the body part moves away from the midline of your body, and I always think of that as being like an abducted person has been taken away.
Like the aliens, yep.
It's an easy way to remember it. An adduction is
adduction,
where it's coming towards the midline, or it's adding to your body.
Nice. But they're not really, in a functional setting, they're not really adducting.
Misnamed, aren't they?
They're very misnamed. They are force coupling with the glutes.
Yeah, not as catchy. No. And I think the names can be misleading. I mean, we got about 300% smarter about Adductor Magnus across 2 conversations that each lasted 10 minutes. And this is, again, shout out to our great physio friends. I think if you want to hang around with smart physios who know some stuff, that really does help a lot. I had a really fascinating conversation with Dr. Galen Mackay, a friend and colleague of mine, who's at the Boomers and also the Australian Opals Medical Services Manager. And Gay was talking about this reconceptualization of Adductor Magnus, that it's actually an external rotator. And I was like,
but it adducts. That's the kind of like the opposite of external.
And then I had a follow-up chat with Kay Copeland, who is also a genius physio and chair of Sports Medicine Australia. Like, Kay is top-notch. And the thing that Gay and Kay have in common is they're real, I'm going to swear, they're real no bullshit people. Like, they're just straight to the big rocks, the meat of issues.
Yeah, no mucking around the boundaries. They get straight to the heart.
No peripheral stuff. Yeah. And so Kay talked about the idea that if you look at the origin of Adductor Magnus, where
the insertion, along the femur?
Yeah. It actually is at the back of the femur, which actually means it's simultaneously an adductor, but also an external rotator of the femur. And I was like, what? And we literally, I hung up the phone.
We went to Essential Anatomy online on our computers.
We were like, what? It was really, mine's blown.
Yeah.
And the research coming out of the Copenhagen group, which is genius physios.
Talk more about them in a second.
But it was that you should be training it. If you want to get a better single leg squat, for instance, Kay said you need to be doing Adductor Magnus work to get a better single leg squat, which was one of the most counterintuitive things I've ever heard.
This is a lot like that story of the time you had your single leg problems way back in the day, and your physio, was it Jack?
Yeah, it was Jack Dix.
Yeah, so Jack would then elbow the hell out of your glute med.
Yeah.
Took you all the way to an 11 out of 10 for pain.
I cried. Yeah.
But then asked you to do a single leg squat, and
my response was, "Are you crazy? You've just killed me."
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to walk for a week. Yeah. But having removed that inhibition from glute med, you're able to smooth out your single leg squat.
Yeah, similar.
And so in a similar but different way, you can activate and prime your adductor magnus for its external rotation capacity to help stabilize the femur as you do single leg movements.
And so I like to make our own science here sometimes. So we went straight away and we played with it ourselves, doing a banded Magnus Bridge, which is just a glute bridge where the band is trying to pull your knee away from your body. It's trying to pull your knee into adduction in the bridge. And we did it straight away with ourselves. And that feels pretty good. And then we started doing it with a few of our athletes, and it tidied up a bunch of single leg squats.
And lunges too. It was really good on lunges.
Really good. We had one negative effect. I had an Olympian WNBL player, like top-notch athlete, and we started with what we thought was the easiest possible version of it, which was just 3x10, pretty light,
with a light band,
and she had like agonizing DOMs for 6 days with it.
Oh wow!
Because
that's an inhibited, turned off adductor magnus.
So we had woken up a muscle that hadn't worked for the previous 10 years, probably, despite all the change of direction and despite playing WNBA, and so that was
because what you can get is what's called a compensatory pattern, where another muscle picks up the slack for an inhibited muscle. So the classic example is your glute max. We sit on it a lot, gets kind of compressed by chairs, and so adductor magnus picks up the slack. So this athlete had strong glutes, but potentially had maybe it was the internal quads, maybe it was the other hamstrings, maybe it was the glutes, doing that job of stabilizing the hip and working overtime for a muscle that had become inhibited.
Yeah, so it was fascinating. So the moral of the story is start pretty slow. I thought we'd started at the slowest point, but you might even just start with some people that just
2 sets of 5.
Yeah, just say hi to that muscle. But then the progression from that is to do the Copenhagen. So
that's the level. That's the Nordic level groin exercise, if you will.
Yeah, I want to tell a story about one of our athletes who's had a groin injury. We did the rehab and then...
Oh, the splits? Yeah, tell that one. This is a great story.
So we had one of our best long-term athletes who's now up at the AAS, champion person and athlete. And she had, probably about age 15, I suppose, was running down the hallway in her socks on polished floorboards.
I thought it was in a game.
No, you haven't heard the full story.
Oh, okay. Sorry, carry on.
So she was running down the hallway in her socks and she slipped and strained her groin. And then we rehabbed her back after that using the Magnus Bridge plus some other stuff, plus the Copenhagen, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and had her back to full strength. Then in the game, she was going to do a jab step, which is where you kind of jab your foot out. But
kind of try and fake an opponent
in
a basketball sense.
And she slipped on a bit of sweat on the floor and did the full splits in front of the whole stadium. It was one of those moments like in a movie where everyone's like, ah, and everyone's just silent.
The music cuts.
And then she got up, kind of shook it out. She's like, I'm fine. And kept on playing and it was no problem. Wow. And I've got no doubt that was because we had built a significant strength reserve in those adductors that enabled them to cope with that sudden, unexpected elongation, and they were just able to cope with it. Just fascinating, yeah. So that's the bang for buck you can get. You can get what should be a horrifying bone, like muscle torn off the bone injury, and you can take that to absolutely no problems. Now, the results may vary, could...
Don't go around trying to do the splits to test out your Copenhagen effectiveness.
But the payoff is that, and the payoff is that your chances of getting any form of groin injury, just lower. Super important in, I think, in women's footy. Super important in soccer in general and in women's soccer.
It's a big one in soccer because they kick across the body.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of rapid loading of that adductor group and adductor magnus as well.
They kick across the body, and it's what, 16 times the cumulative G forces for change of direction.
16 times more change of acceleration, deceleration, change of direction forces than Australian rules football. So soccer is like just change of direction because they spend so much time just doing little jab steps left and right, and they play with a lot more players in a confined space. So it's 11 per side, and they're all in that box, playing so close to goal. So it's a lot more condensed than AFL, so you get a lot more agility work.
Super important. Yeah, and the adductor is, the Copenhagen is a simple thing you can do. Anyone can, if you have land and gravity and people, you can do it. Like it's, if you're working in soccer, if you're working in footy and you're not doing it, you're crazy. So easy to do, and you can scale it as well.
It's one that's tricky to explain in audio. It's like
kind of crack.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Do you feel like you've got it?
I was just going to go very simply. You can flesh on mine.
Yeah.
It's like a side plank, but your top leg is on something supporting your weight. So normally with a side plank, you'd be on your feet on the ground, on your elbow and on your feet, but you put your top leg elevated on something, maybe supported from the knee or from the ankle, and then Darren's going to explain that a little further.
Yeah, I'm not sure you've nailed that. It's hard. Okay, imagine you're lying down on your right side and you've got the instep of your left foot up on a chair, and now you lift your whole body up with that left foot holding you up.
With your elbow on your
right elbow in a plank position. You're now doing a Copenhagen. That may or may not be clearer, but we've both had a crack at it. We'll get a picture as well.
Depending on whether you're a Jacob style or a Durham style learner, hopefully you'll have that covered.
And the trick is, I think, to start. What you're chasing ultimately is a good dose of time multiplied by tension. So time under tension. So in the early days, I think you want to make the tension pretty low because you're just learning how to do it.
Tension could also be a synonym for intensity. So how hard an exercise is.
How hard it is. So you want to make it pretty easy. And the best way to do that is by shortening the lever. So if you want to make the leader long, it's where you've got your foot on the chair or the bench. And if you want to shorten it up, it's where you've got maybe your knee or even the lower portion of your quad, your thigh on it. And then you might do 3 by 10 seconds on day one, and just ease into it.
And you can do it with your foot / knee on a bench, or you can have a teammate hold you by the knee, so they can sort of hold you either side of the knee and lift you up, and then you can sort of lift yourself up into there to be supported by their hands from that. So just like how you can do the Nordic in a field setting. So team sport coaches out there with soccer teams, we don't have access to benches with all the kids at the end of a training to do this. Just partner up. One person holds the ankles for the Nordics, then they hold the knee for the Copenhagen.
The only thing I would say is partner up based on approximate size. You don't want a 30-kilo kid trying to hold up a 70-kilo kid, because now you're doing 70-kilo asymmetrical deadlifts with a 30-kilo kid.
Size by size.
Size by size. And you'd want them to have a straight back when they're doing it. But often there are things you can use. There are inanimate objects around that you can use. It might be there's some benches, bleachers. There'll be something you can use as well, which is it's pretty good if you've got that option. I reckon. So you just build it up, and what you've done is, without too much effort, you've really done the 80-20 of inoculating those groin muscles against injury. Yeah,
because you inoculate those extreme ones, like the story we told of the splits on the court, but also there's just that accumulation of wear and tear that can leave adductors rather, feeling tight and grumpy, and just so they can become an area where it's just doesn't feel strong and powerful and fresh.
And I mean, that's why the groin squeeze test is one of the most important tests that soccer players and AFL teams will use to track is the groin, are the adductors fatiguing?
Which is a really good point, because they'll test that for strength, because a loss of strength will come before
it's really cool.
a pain or an injury situation. So AFL did a fantastic job of basically eliminating OP or osteitis pubis, because they would do this groin test, and groin strength would drop before any pain would present. And so if strength dropped by a certain threshold, well, that athlete needs some treatment and they need some extra work. They need to be deloaded from running, and you could bypass what is a potentially career-ending injury.
Like the adductor squeeze test, that is a ability to actually look into the future. That's one of those incredibly predictive things where you do that and you go, you are almost guaranteed to strain a muscle within the next 30 days. We will deload you.
Yeah, you've got a big fat red flag.
Yeah. So just great. But I think it's one of those things that it's been utilized really heavily within the AFL and to a lesser extent soccer, because soccer's still catching up on some of this stuff. But in junior sports, not much at all. I'd advise it, do a little bit of it probably after your main session. So you might just do it after, if say Sunday is the main training session, do it at the end of that.
Yeah, before cool down. Yeah. Or part of cool down.
Yeah, do that. Like this says that sort of punctuation mark of you've got the actual sports practice. Sports practice finishes, you do a tiny bit of your Nordics, adductors and calf raises, and then proper cool down.
Yeah.
Then you've,
that gives them enough time to recover before the next hard training session. And you don't want to do it at the start because then you'll pre-fatigue groins and you'll set up more problems than you might fix. Especially in the early days.
At the start, you want to do your dynamic stuff. You want to roll, stretch, activate, dynamic. You want to get everything primed. But in terms of actually making legitimate strength and structural gains,
creating adaptations,
you want those structural adaptations to be created at the end. It's not going to put you in harm's way. So I think they're super important, super easy to do. Get around them. I think they're great. We love them.
Yeah.
We've been using them.
Don't love. I hate doing them.
I detest doing them.
They're horrible to do.
I have to do them in my own training. No, I really don't like them at all.
No, they're very painful, very uncomfortable. Just like the Nordic.
But and like say you don't think I'm a hypocrite. My view is I don't do any change direction sport. I'm okay with not doing that. So you
give yourself a pass.
I give myself a pass. But we have been doing them with the Melbourne Ice, the women's ice hockey team that we're working with this year. And the girls have been great that they've really bought into it. They get it. In ice hockey is a ferocious sport, and it's really highly taxing on your hips, on your groin, on your back. And the girls have been great with that. Also been great with their prep. I was so pleased to notice just how well they're nailing all of their warm-up 2.0 stuff.
Yeah, looking after their bodies.
Little varied, obviously, we're not doing all the running stuff.
Yep.
But yeah, killing it. Yeah.
That's awesome. I think that's it, isn't it?
Yeah, it was good.
That's as much as you can talk about adductors, I think.
I think so. So, we'll put in the show notes, what do we got? So we'll find some sort of image of the...
I think I might have to go take one right now. I don't think we have any in the library. So a picture of a Magnus Bridge and one of an easy Copenhagen and a more intense Copenhagen. So the knee support and then the ankle support. Yeah. And I mentioned something. I mentioned a study, the AIS study about injuries. So the 80% of your training load to achieve your goal study.
And maybe if you could dig out the groin squeeze one, that might be cool. There'll be a study showing the correlation between groin strength drop off.
Yeah, I don't remember actually reading the specific study. I read just a couple of articles later, but I'll have a dig. If you want that, that'll be on our website.
Yeah. And the other thing is, to be crystal clear, this is not medical advice. Don't have a groin strain and then start just doing this stuff. You need to go see a physio, osteo, clinician of some sort and actually make sure that what you think you've got is what you've got. And then you need to run this by. This is an area, I think, the adductors are such a tendinous, where they insert, there's so much tendon going on there, you can make stuff grumpy pretty easily if you go gung-ho and you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
So just make sure, if you're healthy and good, go for it. But if you've got an existing pathology, I think it's always good to double check that stuff.
Yeah, we aren't doctors and we don't try to pretend to be ones on the internet.
We did not. Awesome. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.